Hello everyone, and thank you all for tuning in to the first episode of Tips on Writing by Joseph Blake Parker. This series will be dedicated to tips and tricks all to help you improve your writing. Each episode will consist of me reading to you different DeviantArt entries from Joseph Blake Parker's page on how to improve your writing and hopefully get your novel or short story published. Now again, I didn't write these tips. These are all tips created by Joseph Blake Parker, whose DeviantArt page you can go to in the description if you'd like to read all of these before I can upload them. I hope these videos will all help you become better writers, or maybe even get a story of yours published someday. Even if you aren't a writer, these tips may still interest you if you'd simply like to know more about the writing process, or if you're thinking about becoming a writer in the future. And now, without further ado, let's get on with the tips. Part 1. 3 tips on writing a novel that aren't complete BS. Today, I spent a good many hours searching the internet for tips on improving my writing. You know, useful, practical suggestions for someone who's actually written a bit and wants hints on some of the finer points of writing. You know, as opposed to just learning how to get publishers interested in the latest Hunger Games or Twilight knockoff. Well, other than 2 masters of storytelling, Stan Lee and Stephen King, I found nothing. I thought to myself, Blake, even you could provide better writing advice than this. And so I have. Here are 3 non-subjective tips for becoming a better writer. Tip 1. Pay attention to point of view, or POV for short. The first mistake I made in writing my novel, and one that I've seen every single beginning writer's work that I've edited since, is that I really didn't pay attention to the POV in narration. When telling a story, it's important to remember 2 things. 1. Nobody wants God to tell the story. In a room filled with a dozen people, there's so much going on in everyone's head and in their actions that it would fill an entire book in about an hour. And when there's simply too much going on, the reader ceases to care and is very confused. After all, if the reader was God, he or she wouldn't spend their time listening to every monotonous detail of what they were seeing, but instead find something more interesting to watch. Which brings me to point number 2. Pick a focus character, or at least pick one at a time, and tell the story through that person's eyes. This way, readers will pick up on the important details while also having a single focus lens to look through. If this doesn't make sense, imagine how much better a movie is with just one camera perspective used at a time, as opposed to 6 of them all being played simultaneously. Tip 2. Outline your story. I used to just prefer writing freestyle, as most writers begin doing. But when you do that, 2 major things happen. First, with the lack of direction, you stop caring where the story is going, since there's no dramatic force that can force along pointless meandering. Second, if you do not lose interest, your plot will be a noodle-like mess with no structure, and your audience will lose interest. Just like with a television series that has no end or destination in sight. Even if you love your characters, eventually you'll just give up watching because it becomes a dull act of voyeurism where you're just watching a vignette of a life without any actual story. If a solid outline is too restricting, though, just try using the 3-act story structure and just write a paragraph describing each act. This structure will turn the pasta into a carefully molded form until you find yourself eating a lasagna instead of soggy, wet noodles. Tip 3. Don't overpower your characters. At the most basic level, reading a novel is an escape from the world around us. As such, we want the worlds we create in our stories, as well as the characters, to be the embodiment of the ideals we wish were reality. As such, we create flawless heroes, or perfectly flawed heroes, and villains that embody all the evil we see around us, which we wish could be defeated. However, to do so turns your story into a poor sermon, and a badly biased one at that. Not only that, but the audience immediately begins to hate your characters, unless they're brainwashed sort of readers who think that Dr. Manhattan was the hero of Watchmen, or that being a hero when you're invulnerable and beloved by those around you means that you are good, or have some sort of depth of character, as opposed to just being a fascist with an old-fashioned set of principles that you impose on the world. Any other Lex Luthor fans in the house? Instead, you should seek to create characters that illustrate the complexities and flaws in everything, even and especially in your own moral code. You want to create real characters for your audience to believe in and empathize with. In practice, you should be able to name off 3 things that you generally admire for your villains for, as well as 3 things you generally despise your heroes for, giving them flaws to overcome. And avoid the pseudo-flaws that plague literature, like the hero who's just too kind for his own good, or the hero whose traumatic past has made her into a hardened bitch with a secret heart of gold. Doing this creates real characters that your audience can truly escape through, and even learn genuine lessons from, making you, the writer, the real hero of the story. Part 2. 3 reasons to use world creation sheets. So, I was never really interested in creating a perfect universe, and neither will you, or should many writers. However, in my time editing my first work, I found that there were many contradictions and things that simply would not work when I had friends test read my material. For that reason, I had to recreate and redefine my universe from scratch, and then force my story to conform to these standards or create reasonable explanations for why they did not. The results were incredible, and raised my level of writing significantly, driving me to show you the benefits of using a world creation sheet. Reason 1. A world creation sheet will reveal the cosmic order that governs your universe. When I address the question of a world creation sheet, the natural consequences of actions, the results of the ideas of a sort of karmatic force or cosmic justice, just came together. This was much better, as opposed to just acting like a fickle god and forcing the laws of my universe to break as I needed them to. This is important even in creating stories that occur in this world, because your beliefs as to the meaning and origins of the universe will dictate the outcome of your story and the events that occur within. Reason 2. A world creation sheet will force the devices in your story to work together. When friends read my story, they would not really be immersed in the story because the many aspects of the story do not flow together in a unified fashion, almost like different ideas were from different worlds and could not exist believably with the others. Using a world creation sheet will create a unified history for every aspect of your story, the characters, the universe, the forces at work, and everything else, so that they flow together. Reason 3. A world creation sheet can fix up the motivations of your characters. As most world creation sheets contain background history for the types of characters, races, species, etc., your character personalities, motivations, and interactions will see overall improvement when you're forced to address how they came to be, and the history of their interactions. The basic conclusion is that using a world creation sheet will take the ideas in your head, unify them, and help them work together so that your audience can enjoy the story. And it'll force you, the author, to address your beliefs as to how the real world, or just your fictional world, works. From your degree of faith in what you're taught about American history, to the involvement of conspiracies in the shaping of the world, to the role of God or gods in the cosmos, your ideas will take shape, and you will become more purposeful and deliberate in crafting your story. Part 3. 7 tips for editing a novel. Once you, a friend, or a client have finished the draft of any type of work, you reach the editing stage. Unfortunately, I found very little literature as to the editing process, save for grammar tips and some technical cleanups. For this reason, I'm writing a few quick tips for editing the first draft of a written work, particularly works of fiction. Tip 1. Let the story sit. I've heard that C.S. Lewis let his stories sit an entire year after their first draft before he edited them. There's a twofold wisdom in this. First, time gives you a chance to detach yourself from your story so you're not so emotionally invested in it, and forces you to take a step back. From a more detached perspective, and you'll be able to edit your work subjectively and not so emotionally. Second, letting your story sit gives you time to forget it. This is important because when authors read their own work, they tend to fill in the gaps with information that's in their own head. In other words, they can't see what's missing because their brain is already filling in the gaps, even without the written word. A year may be a bit much, but I advise writing a draft for a new novel or writing a short story before ever returning to your own previous work. Tip 2. Read the story aloud. Even if you're only whispering, reading a work aloud allows your brain to hear the structure of sentences. If one comes out a little wonky, your subconscious will pick up on it, helping you find errors that you would have otherwise missed. Tip 3. Check your point of view. When you go back through your story, read it through the eyes of the narrator or focus character. Make sure that your audience can see all the important details of the POV character. If the POV character is looking someone in the eye, for example, make sure that he or she cannot see the other character has their fingers crossed behind their back. Tip 4. Don't be afraid of the delete button. If you are a good writer, then you will use less than 5% of the text from your first draft, if even that. Think of the first draft as setting the foundation of a building. By the end of the construction, you don't want to see the wood planks or steel beams or concrete holding the building together, and neither do you want to see the building material that is your first draft. It's still there, and it's meaningful, but it's not meant for your audience to ever see. Tip 5. Mark what works, what doesn't, and what you've learned. As you're editing your first draft, do so visibly, and keep a copy of the first draft. Mark what worked in the story, and what did not, and what you learned in every chapter. This way, you can effectively clean the rest of the chapters, firmly establishing what you've learned from the previous draft, and a copy to help teach other writers the techniques you learned early on. Tip 6. Focus on the 3 worst flaws in your draft. As you edit, find the 3 greatest weaknesses in the draft, then write them down, write down how you plan to solve the problem, and then go through the entire manuscript with those 3 flaws as a sort of checklist to edit every chapter. This will hone your editing focus and make your writing much more purposeful, while also not giving you too much to handle or remember. Tip 7. Find a brutal editor or reader. The most important step in being a writer is finding someone to read your drafts who will tell you the truth, regardless of your feelings. This person must be encouraging, telling you what they liked about the story, but also have the guts to comment about what they hated, hurting your feelings and putting a burning pain inside you to fix the problems and make your art even better than before. Harsh, perhaps, but a true writer is not in the craft for the warm feeling of constant praise, but for creating the best imaginable work as a gift to the world. Part 4. 6 Tips for Writing and Storytelling from Stan Lee. Recently, Stan Lee made a YouTube video in order to help writers and storytellers of all types. And there's something wonderfully simple about how Stan Lee perceives writing. The following are the 6 tips that I picked up from his lecture. Tip 1. Accept commissions as boundaries meant to challenge your creativity. Chances are that your writing dream will not take off with your book or comic becoming an instant hit. You'll have to work for companies, accept commissions, and bide your time until you publish your masterpiece. When you do accept commissions and have to work in the box, view those limitations as creative blocks, obstacles that exist so that you can stretch your abilities in order to make your commission as wonderful as what you would make your private works. This is a common technique. In fact, for other forms of writing like poetry, as the brain will be stretched in this action and come up with ideas normally beyond those gained with no limitations. Don't believe me? The X-Men were Stan Lee's commission to make a superhero team. Tip 2. Read a lot, and read the classics. Stan Lee spoke a lot for his love of characters such as Sherlock Holmes, and while some of the classics may be a struggle to get through, to study them is to study our heritage as writers. We get to see their evolution as storytellers, and see the great works that turned writing into a desired art form. That array of tools exists in order to teach you to become a better writer, free of modern cliches and tricks that we otherwise would not have seen. Tip 3. Write what you want to read. If you write something that pleases yourself, it can be genuine, Stan Lee says in the video. And it's true. As much as we might like to think it, we're not wholly unique in our likes and dislikes. We share them with most of the human race. The same applies to art. If only a very small percentage of people share your likes, 1% or less than 1% of the human population is still a substantial little group. So there's no reason to feel like you need to write what's popular or trending in order to become an author. Tip 4. Allow real-world events to influence your writing, but don't let it dictate your story. We've all been so infuriated by the world around us that we want to address it in our stories. But this isn't necessary. Our subconscious, obsessive minds will always wrestle with those huge things we care about, and so those themes will appear on the page. Nor should we fight it, but exaggerate it. Nancy Farmer's Sea of Trolls used this idea and made a story inspired by terrorism, exaggerated the terrorists into Vikings, and yet made them complete characters who were human and could be empathized with. Tip 5. Find something specific that sets your character apart from all others of their type. Everything that can be done has been done, and no matter how much you try to avoid that, you will find that your character is similar to another in some way. Instead, try and focus on what sets your character apart from those in his or her archetype. For example, Stan Lee made a lawyer character, and decided that the things that set him apart was that he was blind, dressed up like the devil, and hunted down those who escaped justice. Tip 6. Discover the dramatic force, the tension between good and evil. From the beginning, decide what makes the story move forward. What does the hero want? What does the villain want? And how will you arrange this conflict so that it fuels the events of an entire book? And so, I leave you all with one last piece of advice from the man Stan Lee himself. I can only write for myself, and I can only hope, if I really like this, hopefully, there are other people who will have the same tastes I do. Welp, that was the first episode of Tips on Writing by Joseph Blake Parker. Thank you all for listening. No, this episode isn't going to be like other episodes. It's quite a bit longer, consisting of 4 entries instead of just 1, which will be what the later episodes will consist of. I did this so that people who weren't sure if they'd follow the series just from the first entry could hopefully make up their minds by listening to more. Now, the coming videos will be rather short, but due to how short each entry is, you all can at least expect them to be uploaded rather frequently. Next episode, we will be going over 6 tips in crafting each chapter of your novel. And until then, I'll see you all next time.